blue streak splits a quiet kitchen, and for one impossible second, everything the camera thought it knew about the room seems to vanish. That flash is the kind of image that makes you blink, replay, and then wonder whether your eyes can be trusted at all. In a world saturated with footage, there are still moments that feel, in the bone, inexplicable. Images that refuse easy categorization and force us to ask a simple, urgent question. What just happened? Case Texas Blue Flash, Suburban Kitchen, recent years. It began like so many viral clips. A homeowner checking a doorbell camera, an ordinary suburban evening. The recording holds the routine, a dog moving in the hall, the glow of a kitchen appliance, until a single frame contains a streak of intense blue light. It crosses the room in a slanted line, bright enough to register as a separate object, and in the frames that follow, the camera skips. Viewers notice three things immediately. The blue is unnaturally saturated. There are no new shadows cast by such a bright source. And crucially, a small sequence of frames appears to be missing or corrupted. Erica Garner watched that 1-second slice of footage the same way millions of others would, stunned, trying to reconcile what she'd seen with what she had lived. Her immediate reaction was disbelief. She had been at home, she had not felt anything unusual, and yet the camera, a passive witness in her hallway, recorded an event that should not have been there. That tension between lived experience and recorded evidence is where this case starts to bend the rules. A forensic look begins with the footage itself. Frame by frame, the streak is narrow and consistent across the few frames where it is visible. There is no recorded flash elsewhere in the house. The overhead lights remain unchanged before and after. When Andrew McCarthy, a photography expert, examined the clip, he focused on the camera's response, exposure values, sensor behavior, and how a sensor integrates brief bursts of light. McCarthy noted that some sensors can produce intense color artifacts when hit by high-energy light sources outside their nominal range. But such artifacts usually carry telltale signs, blooming around edges, a wash across multiple pixels, or shifts in exposure that ripple into neighboring frames. None of those usual signs appeared. The blue streak is isolated, and it does not create apparent light spill on nearby surfaces. That absence of shadow or reflection matters. Chase Klitsky, a forensic investigator who has worked numerous camera analyses, pointed out that a real energetic light source in a small, enclosed space should throw at least a faint shadow or specular highlight on reflective surfaces. The kitchen counter, a stainless kettle, even the glossy tiles would normally register some trace. They did not. If not a real light, what else could the image be? Technical failure is the logical next hypothesis. Video encoders, especially those in consumer cameras, compress footage aggressively to save space. Compression can introduce blocky artifacts, color shifts, and, on rare occasions, frame losses. Klitsky conducted a close inspection of the file and identified a pattern consistent with dropped frames and encoder anomalies. In plain terms, when a camera buffers or a connection hiccups, the video can lose information, and the reconstruction algorithm fills gaps with approximations that sometimes look like sudden blips. Deanna Hentz, an atmospheric scientist consulted about the clip, scanned meteorological records for that neighborhood and timestamp. She searched for lightning strikes, electromagnetic disturbances, and transient luminous events, the kinds of natural atmospheric flashes that can produce unexpected light displays. Weather radar and lightning detection networks showed no strikes near the time of the recording. No storm activity was in play. The camera hardware showed no indications of internal arcing or power surges either. Laboratory tests followed. Bulb and fixture stress tests were performed to evaluate whether internal lighting could momentarily produce a colored flash without a wider thermal or luminous signature. The tests simulated power fluctuations and filament failures. Many produced flickers, bangs, or wide-spectrum glows, but none matched the precise saturated blue ribbon recorded in that frame. Those results steered investigators away from a simple blown bulb explanation. Yet even with technical reasons identified, anomalies remained. The missing frames suggest a file-level problem, yes, but they do not explain why the artifact takes the shape and color it does, nor why it appears so localized. McCarthy acknowledged that cameras do occasionally capture optical noise that resembles coherent shapes. Kletsky conceded that file corruption could generate bizarre artifacts. Deanna Hens conceded that rare atmospheric phenomena, sprites, blue jets, or cosmic ray strikes on a sensor, can create unexpected effects on imaging equipment, though the probability of such an occurrence inside a closed domestic environment at ground level is extremely low. Another angle to consider is human perception. When a single frame is odd enough to draw all attention to itself, the brain leans toward narrative. We prefer agency. A thing happened, someone caused it, there is a story to tell. That instinct is useful, but it can amplify the sense that a clip is more coherent than the data support. With that cautionary note, the clip was tested for tampering. Forensic file integrity checks, metadata analysis, and hash comparisons were run where possible. The file did not show signs of conventional editing. Timestamps were consistent. There were no splice artifacts that would indicate a cut-and-paste job. Even absent tampering, the possibility of rare sensor phenomena remains. A cosmic ray hitting the camera's sensor can produce a transient artifact, a bright pixel or cluster, sometimes with unusual color. These strikes are real physical events, but their rarity and the specific manifestation seen here made them an unlikely but not impossible cause. This is where the case slides toward what investigators called currently unexplained. The most probable technical explanation, encoder frame loss, accounts for the gap in footage but does not satisfy every peculiarity. Atmospheric causes are improbable given the weather data. Sensor-level events are possible but statistically remote. For a moment, the idea of time glitch or optical anomaly floated in public conversation. Those labels capture the emotional reading. Something temporal or extraordinary pierced the ordinary. But experts caution against leaping from the unusual to the paranormal. Michio Kaku or Hakim Olusei are not necessary figures in this domestic question. Advanced theoretical physics may allow for speculations about uncommon interactions at the quantum level, but the consensus is clear. There is no known mechanism that would produce a localized blue streak inside a room without leaving physical traces or corroborating data. When the evidence is mixed in this way, investigators are left with a measured verdict, not a verdict of wonder, not an endorsement of mystery for mystery's sake, but a statement of limits. The clip resists a clean explanation. The most straightforward technical hypotheses explain some elements but not all. The natural explanations are either absent in the record or statistically unlikely. For now, the designation is precise, currently unexplained. That phrasing carries both humility and invitation. Humility because it resists sensational conclusion, invitation because it asks for more data. A different camera angle, a longer recording, or corroborating instrumentation could tip the scales. If this kind of deep dive into strange footage interests you, subscribe for more investigations like this one. But the blue streak is only the beginning. In Spain, almost 50 years ago, a different kind of image kept returning. Not a flash across a room but faces appearing on a kitchen floor, over and over, until the phenomenon drew pilgrims and investigations alike. Case Belmez Faces, Belmez de la Moraleda, Spain, 1971 onward. The Belmez story unspools slowly, the way folklore does. A small house, a working-class kitchen, a woman sweeping and finding in the rough concrete the suggestion of a face. Not a painting so much as a relief. Eyes, nose, mouth emerging from the gray. Over weeks and months the face is rearranged, darkened, and at times appeared where none had been before. Neighbors talked. News crews arrived. The faces were photographed, recorded, and, crucially for investigators, examined in labs. Maria Gomez Camara became associated with the site as a witness and one of the householders who saw the marks manifest in daily life. Her account, consistently reported, was of seeing features appear where there had been only plain concrete. For believers, the faces were a miracle and overt sign. For skeptics, they were a multiple conspiracy of hoax, pareidolia, and profit. For scientists, the case presented an opportunity. A substrate, concrete with recurrent anomalies, repeatedly examined under controlled conditions. Infrared scanning and electron microscopy were among the tests applied. The surfaces were sampled, layers were analyzed. The surprising result was the apparent absence of conventional paint or pigment in areas that, to the eye, looked painted. Microscopic tests failed to find an applied pigment layer consistent with ordinary artistic techniques. Chemical assays that would detect typical paints returned negative. That finding complicated the easiest skeptical explanation, that someone painted faces in the night. Yet absence of paint is not proof of the miraculous. Several scientific hypotheses were proposed. One line of inquiry suggested that chemical reactions within the concrete, influenced by moisture, salts, or cleaning agents, could produce differential staining. A bleach hypothesis was floated by some analysts. Alkaline or oxidative compounds applied to the surface might alter the hydration state of the cement, revealing darker aggregates or changing surface texture in ways that resemble facial features. Such processes can be subtle and localized, especially in a substrate as heterogeneous as concrete. Archaeological context deepened the stakes. The house sat on ground where, historically, burials had once existed. Disturbed soil layers, overlooked graves, or shifting mineral deposits beneath the house raised the possibility, in the minds of some observers, of a connection between the past and the present surface. Michael O'Neill, described in contemporary sources as a researcher who studies purported miracles, noted the cultural and spiritual reading that listeners naturally bring to such a case. Pilgrims arrived. Some reported emotional experiences in the kitchen. These human responses, while powerful, do not equate to scientific proof. Skeptics suggested human intervention in subtler forms than paint. Microabrasion, cooling of the concrete, or controlled chemical etching could create faces without leaving obvious traces to casual microscopy. Tests attempted to replicate the phenomenon by applying various chemical agents and controlled abrasion to fresh concrete slabs. Some combinations produced marks that, under certain light and angle, resembled facial features. But lab recreations have their limits. The Belmez faces continued to display a temporality. They would deepen, fade, and sometimes reappear in different configurations that resisted clean replication in a lab setting. One research team performed a careful catalog of what had been tested: surface chemistry, pigment scans, photographic documentation over time, and structural analysis of the concrete slab. Their conclusion was cautious. Scientifically, they could not detect a conventional pigment application. Chemically, some reactions could account for localized staining. Socially, the collective attention and repeated cleaning, photographing, and handling of the floor introduced opportunities for both inadvertent and deliberate modification. Crucially, an unresolved element remained. What would be required to move the case from unexplained to explained? The team specified that truly resolving the question would mean one of three outcomes. First, conclusive laboratory reproduction of the faces using materials and methods consistent with the original timeline and observed patterns. Second, discovery of direct evidence of an applied medium at microscopic resolution, something like a pigment layer beneath a crystalline overgrowth that had been overlooked. Third, credible admission or documentation of human fabrication contemporaneous with the appearances. None of those three had been achieved to universal satisfaction, so the verdict stayed, for many, in a gray zone. Some observers remained convinced of the spiritual significance. Others suspected trickery. A subset of scientists left the case labeled unresolved under the specific criteria that had been set. Exactly what tests had been performed and what evidence was still missing were documented, and those missing elements defined the boundary of uncertainty. The Belmez faces therefore entered the archive of cultural mysteries as a case where conventional methods failed to settle the question decisively. What unites the Texas blue flash and the Belmez faces is a structural similarity. Both start with an arresting image, a streak of blue light, a human face appearing in concrete. that triggers an emotional response and immediate search for explanation. Both invite laboratory tests and expert scrutiny. Both generate competing hypotheses: technical failure, rare natural phenomena, chemical reactions, or human agency. And both end, at least for now, with a measured humility. Some things tested and explained, some not. From electrical anomalies to spiritual claims, from sensor artifacts to chemical interactions, these cases reveal how the modern world channels ancient impulses. We still seek meaning in moments that break the ordinary. We assemble experts to poke, prod, and reason. We file tests and publish results. Sometimes the record returns a tidy answer. Sometimes it exposes new ambiguity. The next case takes us back further in time, into galleries and churches, where paint and pigment become evidence for a different kind of temptation. The temptation to read modern objects into historical images, and in doing so, to propose extraordinary explanations like time travel, case paintings and anachronisms, various European works, 19th century and earlier. The internet loves a visual hook, and an anachronistic image offers a perfect one. A 19th century painting supposedly shows a figure holding what looks like a smartphone. Across message boards and social feeds, the images traveled fast. A devotional painting with an object protruding from a sitter's hand. A fresco where an odd rod-like shape sits near a patron. Armchair sleuths saw antennas, handheld devices, even cameras. Allegations of time travel and secret histories proliferated in the comment threads. Art historians responded with a steadying hand. Visual context matters in art. What looks like a handset can be, in its cultural and iconographic setting, a devotional book, a prayer bead, a scepter, or a liturgical implement. In the case of the so-called smartphone painting, close observation and archival research identified the object as a small, gilded devotional book, a common attribute in portraits of pious figures. Similar misidentifications recur: globes of creation mistaken for futuristic devices, staff-like objects read as antennae, dust and craquelure interpreted as deliberate modern details. The artists named in these viral threads, Waldmüller, Salimbeni, Romano, worked in traditions laden with symbol. An artist might include a bound book to signify learning or piety. A scepter or rod indicated authority. Patrons wanted to display particular attributes that spoke to status, learning, or sanctity. Those symbols translate imperfectly across centuries. When a modern viewer, accustomed to rectangular screens and metallic slickness, sees a rectangular object, the brain rapidly proposes an identity it knows best: the phone. Some scientists and physicists occasionally wander into the cultural conversation, invited by the dramatic speculation. Hakim Olusei or Michio Kaku may be cited out of context as if the endorsement of remote theoretical possibility turns a misunderstood prop into evidence for time travel. Experts make a useful correction. Theoretical physics allows some exotic constructs, wormholes, closed time-like curves, in mathematical models, but translating those speculative equations into practical human travel requires a cascade of assumptions that sit far beyond current scientific capability. In short, even if time travel is a tantalizing theoretical possibility on paper, the leap from that to a 19th century pilgrim holding a smartphone is unjustified by the art historical evidence. Importantly, these cases show how collective projection shapes interpretation. A group of viewers primed by a cultural narrative about time machines and conspiracy will select details that align with the story and ignore alternative explanations. The internet amplifies confirmation bias. A cropped image circulated without provenance invites leaps that full documentation dispels. Art historians emphasize provenance research, material analysis, and technical examinations. Infrared reflectography, pigment analysis, and documentary context as antidotes to quick claims. When those methods are applied, the extraordinary claim loses momentum. The object is identified as a period-appropriate prop. The painting's date is confirmed. The image returns to the domain of misidentification, spectacular in its viral life, but mundane once examined. Still, these episodes are instructive. They reveal the social dynamics that convert ambiguous evidence into sensational claims. They also show how scientific authority functions differently depending on the field. A physicist can explain why time travel remains in the realm of theory. An art historian can identify the more plausible object in the painting. The two disciplines together help constrain imagination without crushing curiosity. If you followed so far, the pattern should be emerging. Arresting image, emotional reaction, methodical testing, and then one of three outcomes. A mundane explanation exposed, a probable hoax uncovered, or an unresolved residue that needs more data. But not all cases fall neatly into those categories. Some sit at the border between natural wonder and curated spectacle. One of the most visually arresting of those sites at a lake in East Africa. Case: Lake Natron. Mummified animals, haunting landscapes, and human staging. Lake Natron produces images that look like still frames from a myth. Birds and small animals, their feathers and skin hardened in crusts of mineral, appear almost petrified, statues frozen mid-gesture under a red-tinged sky. The photos circulated widely. Many viewers described an instinctive revulsion or awe, unable to tell whether what they were seeing was nature's sculpture or a dystopian tableau. Scientific explanation here begins with chemistry. Lake Natron is highly alkaline, with a pH driven by evaporative concentration and mineral input. The environment is hostile to most life. When animals die and are exposed to the lake's salts, their tissues can undergo a kind of mineral preservation. Salts replace water in tissues, inhibiting microbial decay and, over time, solidifying soft tissues into a preserved state. Dr. Bob Anderson, a geologist familiar with saline environments, explained how such alkalinity can produce desiccation and mineral crusting that arrest decomposition. The result can look like petrification to a camera. Beyond chemistry, biological processes matter. Some organisms carry microbial communities that interact with saline minerals in ways that accelerate preservation. Dr. Stephanie Schuttler, a wildlife biologist, described how the combination of high alkalinity, rapid desiccation, and mineral-rich waters can preserve the morphology of a carcass, while leaving the internal composition altered. In other words, the surface appearance can be astonishingly intact, while the interior has been chemically transformed. But the story has another layer. The photographer behind many of the most striking images later admitted to arranging some animal remains to achieve dramatic compositions. That admission complicates the ethical and evidentiary picture. On one hand, the natural process accounts for how a body became preserved. On the other, human staging shapes perception. When a photographer moves a carcass into an artful pose or positions it on a salt-encrusted outcrop, the image becomes both a record of a natural process and a curated artifact. The mixed nature of the Lake Natron images underlines a theme running through these cases. The boundary between natural phenomenon and human mediation is porous. A striking photograph may capture a real, explainable process, but the photographer's choices, which animals to photograph, how to arrange them, which frames to publish, mediate the viewer's impression. Ethical questions arise around representation and the temptation to dramatize. The public, confronted with such imagery, must parse the documented natural science from the editorial choices that shape the final frame. At its core, Lake Natron is not an argument for the supernatural. It is rather an instance where the raw power of nature, coupled with human artifice, creates images that strain belief. The scientific consensus converges. Mineral mummification explains the phenomenon, while human staging explains the heightened drama seen in many viral photos. But as with the previous cases, nuance matters. The natural process is real and scientifically describable, yet the stories we tell about it can be shaped or distorted by human hands. This is the midpoint of our journey through images that are hard to believe. We have moved from a suburban blue streak that defies a tidy explanation to faces emerging in concrete that resist conventional forensic answers, to paintings misread as proof of impossible travel. and finally to a lake where chemistry and curation combine to produce visual nightmares. Each case embodies a tension between astonishment and skepticism, between the way an image grabs us and the way evidence pins it down. There are still more episodes to examine. An upside-down projection that looks like an alternate room, a doorbell clip in which a person appears to vanish, a dash cam that seems to swallow a car, and a forest mirror that tempts passers-by into thinking they've stepped into another world. Those cases will test different corners of our toolkit: optics and the camera obscura phenomenon, the quirks of digital video compression, the mechanical realities of fences and gates, and the craft of staged illusion. Before we move on, it's worth reflecting on one common thread. Each story asks us to consider how we trust what we see. Cameras are treated as neutral witnesses, and often they are, but they are not infallible. Sensors have limits, encoders make approximations. Light behaves in ways our intuition does not always predict. At the same time, people see patterns where none are intended. Human cognition loves faces, narratives, and agency. That propensity for pattern making is not a flaw. It is a survival trait. But in the modern visual ecosystem, it can create fertile ground for mystery to flourish. And so the work of investigation becomes methodical. Assemble data, test hypotheses, recreate conditions, ask which explanations are probable, which are possible, and which are fanciful. When no single explanation satisfies every piece of evidence, mark the case precisely, unresolved until further data arrives. In many ways, that label is not a failure of science, it is its most honest posture. The next segment will take us into a bedroom where houses appear upside down on a wall, then to a doorbell clip that shows a sudden disappearance, and finally into a forest where a mirror seems to open into another world. Each of those episodes leans on different principles: optics, compression artifacts, and practical trickery. And together they form the concluding act of our investigation into imagery that is hard to believe. Before we advance, remember this: the images we cannot accept quickly are the ones that teach us the most about how perception, technology, and human storytelling intersect. The bedroom in Weston-super-Mare looks ordinary, until you notice the walls are not behaving like walls. In a short clip shared online, a young woman sits on her bed. Behind her, the wallpaper is familiar, but the projection on the opposite wall shows houses and sky turned upside down, an entire neighborhood inverted, as if gravity had paused and chosen a new orientation. It's the kind of image that makes you tilt your head and check the camera settings twice. When investigators obtained higher resolution stills and a longer copy of the recording, the first step was to reconstruct the geometry of the room. What might produce a clear, inverted projection of a distant scene on an interior wall? Optical physicists pointed immediately to a centuries-old principle: the camera obscura. A camera obscura is a simple optical device. A small aperture admits light from an external scene and projects it, inverted, onto an opposite surface. No lens is required, a pinhole will do. In a darkened room, a clear upside-down image can appear, surprisingly crisp if the aperture is the right size and the external scene is sufficiently bright. Recreation tests were instructive. With curtains drawn except for a tiny hole pinched between fabric layers, and with a brightly lit row of houses outside, the projected image on the bedroom wall matched the viral clip in orientation and relative clarity. Mick West, who has analyzed many viral visual hoaxes and tricks, emphasized the simplicity of this physics. You don't need a gimmick. Just a small aperture, the right contrast, and the human tendency to be startled by an apparently impossible image. In other words, accidentally created projections are plausible. A gap in a curtain, a dangling curtain pull with a tiny hole, or a broken blind can turn a private room into a temporary external screen. But the Weston case required more than a plausibility argument. It demanded a forensic accounting of alternatives. Could a reflection or a digital overlay explain the clip? Video file checks showed no splice artifacts, and the projected image's movement synchronized with the external lighting changes captured by a second exterior camera in the homeowner's possession. That correlation argued against post-production compositing. Instead, the sequence of evidence pointed to a genuine in-camera optical projection created by a small, unintended aperture. The verdict for Weston-super-Mare, then, lands in a non-mystical category: an accidental optical phenomenon. It's a reminder that ancient physics remains relevant in the age of smartphones. An upside-down world on a bedroom wall is startling, but not supernatural. It is a demonstration that small apertures and bright exteriors can conspire to produce images our intuition reads as impossible. Not all vanished people are the product of optics. Sometimes the gap in evidence is digital, not metaphysical. A doorbell camera clip from a suburban doorstep shows a man walking across frame and then, for a single moment, gone. A small flash, a missing segment of footage, and no trace of him in subsequent frames. Online, such clips are fertile ground for wild explanations. Was it teleportation? A glitch in reality? Again, the investigative work looked to the most prosaic mechanisms first. Video compression, the method by which cameras shrink hours of footage into manageable file sizes, is efficient but not perfect. Many consumer devices use codecs that compress by storing differences between frames, rather than full images every single time. When a network hiccup occurs, a weak Wi-Fi burst, a cloud service timeout, a buffering lull, the camera or the recorder can drop frames or transmit incomplete packets. When playback reconstructs the clip, the missing data is sometimes filled in by algorithms that estimate motion, or the gap is displayed as a brief freeze, a skipped segment, or a block-colored artifact. Michael Primo, a video systems expert consulted on the doorbell case, explained that dropped frame events can create the visual impression of sudden disappearance, especially when the subject's motion crosses a compression boundary or when the encoder encounters transient corruption. Macro blocking, a specific compression artifact, can produce geometric pixelated distortions that occlude parts of a scene. In the doorbell clip, frame-by-frame inspection revealed a short interval where macro blocks did not resolve into coherent imagery. Rather than showing a person, the player displayed a patchwork of approximated pixels. Metadata analysis confirmed a brief interruption in data packets logged by the camera. Network diagnostics from the homeowner's router showed a short but noticeable packet loss spike at the moment of the event. Taken together, these technical data did not prove a miraculous disappearance. They demonstrated a typical failure mode of consumer video systems. A related but separate episode involved a dashboard camera in Georgia. A dash cam captured a vehicle near a fence. At one point, as the fence was being installed in the vicinity, the car appears to pass through a newly set post in a way that startled first responders watching the playback. Lieutenant Wayne Daniels, who reviewed the footage, described how fence posts are sometimes set into sleeves or temporary supports during installation. In some cases, a car driving alongside the fence line can momentarily align with a post that appears superimposed on the vehicle from a particular vantage point. When multiple elements, camera angle, depth perception, and ongoing construction, coincide, the human eye can interpret the scene as physically impossible. A careful on-site reenactment showed that the car did not pass through solid material. Rather, the camera's line of sight and the staggered placement of posts created the illusion of interpenetration. The dashcam was recording at a fixed focal length and compressing data in real time, which accentuated the effect. These camera-based anomalies intersect with larger, speculative scientific conversations that occasionally leach into public discourse. Photonic teleportation experiments, quantum state transfers, and lab-scale teleportation of information excite headlines. Yet the theoretical and experimental frameworks for quantum teleportation are tightly constrained. They operate on quantum states of particles under controlled laboratory conditions, not on macroscopic human bodies or moving cars. Physicists caution against conflating experimental physics with everyday disappearances. The mechanisms behind a missing frame on a consumer camera are mundane and well understood. Invoking quantum teleportation for a doorbell clip is a category error. Having walked the tightrope between optics and compression, our last case examines deliberate illusion. a forest mirror video that captured a hiker stepping toward a mirror and, apparently, into it, returning moments later from the other side. On the clip, the hiker approaches a large, freestanding mirror set among trees. With a single step, the person seems to step through the reflective surface and vanish, only to reappear a beat later walking out from behind the mirror. The visual reads like cinema, an impossible portal in a rustic grove. Forensics and skepticism approach the footage with familiar tools. Look for edits, study shadows, test mirror angles, and reconstruct the set. Mick West and other experienced analysts pointed to simple stagecraft. A freestanding mirror with a soft frame can conceal a walk-through opening if cleverly disguised. If the mirror is actually a lightweight frame covered with a reflective sheet or two-way glass, assistants behind the mirror can create the illusion of people stepping through. A more sophisticated method uses a split-screen edit, timed with a precise movement. A pre-planned camera position hiding a seam in the foliage can complete the deception. Reconstruction was decisive. Investigators replicated the stunt with a full-size framed panel, hinged at one edge to swing open toward the inside of the frame. With careful placement of leaves and underbrush, and with the camera mounted at the same height as in the original clip, the reproduction produced an identical effect, the appearance of uninterrupted reflection as a person passed through. Close examination of the viral clip's audio track offered additional clues. A faint change in ambient noise where the wind muffled during the critical moment, consistent with a person moving out of the microphone's direct path. No metadata or digital splice suggested an edit, but that absence is consistent with a practical physical trick that requires no post-production. The hiker's reappearance from behind the mirror could be staged by an accomplice, or the same actor slipping around the hinged frame. Because the forest mirror exploit replicates easily and aligns with the physical evidence, the conclusion here is a probable hoax, executed with practical theatricality. That verdict does not denigrate the wonder the clip evokes. The art of illusion is designed to surprise. It does, however, restore the action to human agency, rather than supernatural causation. We have now walked through a range of cases that are hard to believe. A stubborn blue streak in a suburban kitchen, faces that materialize in concrete, paintings mistakenly read as proof of time travel, mineral mummified birds arranged for dramatic effect, a bedroom that briefly displays an inverted world, a doorbell clip that seemingly erases a person, a dash cam that suggests physics-defying movement, and a forest mirror that promises passage between worlds. Each episode follows the same investigative arc: attention to the initial image, careful testing, expert interpretation, and a verdict aligned to the weight of evidence. There remains an important meta-question beneath these discrete cases. Why do certain images, above others, seize us so completely? Part of the answer is cognitive. Human perception evolved to detect patterns, faces, motion, agency. Pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful shapes where none were intentionally produced, is an adaptive feature that makes us quick at spotting people in foliage or hunters in dim light. In modern contexts, where our primary access to faraway events is mediated through screens, that pattern seeking can misinterpret artifacts of optics, compression, or material aging as intentional signals. The camera and the internet that amplifies what it records create a feedback loop where ambiguous images gain social momentum and become harder to dislodge from public imagination. Technology plays a second role. Cameras are rarely neutral. Lenses distort, sensors introduce noise, and compression fills gaps with approximations. As we encountered in the Texas Blue Streak, a rare sensor event or a momentary packet loss can yield an image that resists straightforward explanation. Each technical process, capture, encode, transmit, decode, and display, is an opportunity for anomalies. Knowing the failure modes of these systems provides a powerful explanatory toolbox, but it also requires expertise that most viewers do not have. That gap between what an image appears to show and what a camera system can actually record is fertile ground for extraordinary claims. Social dynamics are the third thread. Stories of the inexplicable circulate, because they satisfy emotional and cultural needs. A face appearing on a kitchen floor can become a pilgrimage site, because people find meaning in proximity to the uncanny. Viral images of mummified birds ignite moral outrage or fascination, and the photographer's decisions about composition shape public reaction. An inverted bedroom wall becomes a meme because it taps into a collective appetite for the uncanny. The internet accelerates these phenomena, often divorcing images from context. Cropping, captioning, and selective sharing amplify the most startling interpretation. Finally, there is an epistemic humility embedded in the investigative posture we have taken. In several cases, the Texas flash, the Belmez faces, investigators reached a cautious, currently unexplained. That admission is not a failure. It is an accurate reflection of where the evidence leads. For the Texas clip, multiple plausible technical mechanisms account for parts of the phenomenon, but none address every detail. Absent additional corroborating instrumentation, the case cannot be closed. For Belmez, careful laboratory analysis failed to find conventional pigments, yet tests that would conclusively reproduce the observed temporality and reappearance patterns were not achieved. The scientists cataloged precisely what had been tested and what evidence would be necessary to move the case into a resolved category. A reproducible laboratory synthesis matching the timing and morphology, discovery of a hidden applied medium, or contemporaneous admission documentation of fabrication. Without any of those, the mystery persists at the boundary between the known and the unknown. This boundary is instructive. It exposes the limits of single-source visual evidence, the importance of methodical testing, and the ways social attention can outpace technical context. It also suggests a healthier stance toward the inexplicable. Wonder, yes, but tempered with an appetite for data. For journalists, scientists, and curious viewers alike, that means 3 practical habits. First, seek provenance. Where did the image originate and what are the chain of custody details? Second, demand multiple modalities of evidence, corroborating instruments, eyewitness reports with independent timestamps, or physical tests that reproduce the phenomenon. Third, when experts disagree, catalog precisely what was tested and what remains unknown. An unresolved label should come with a checklist of missing data. There is another lesson here about human creativity. Hoaxes, staging, and misinterpretation remind us that our cultural imagination is eager to produce narratives. Sometimes the narrative is benevolent, a pilgrim's faith given expression by devotion to a site. Sometimes it is commercial, a photographer composing a sensational image. Sometimes it is mischievous or political. In every case, the fact that humans can and will edit their reality calls for critical attention. That need not erase the emotional power of the images. It simply asks that the power be understood as partly constructed. At the same time, some episodes resist full demystification. To label a case unexplained is to invite more rigorous observation, not to endorse the supernatural. The most responsible response to a stubborn anomaly is to build better instruments, collect independent data, and maintain openness without credulity. Science advances by turning unexplained observations into testable hypotheses. For a homeowner who captured a blue streak, that could mean installing redundant cameras and magnetometers. For a site with recurrent floor faces, that could mean controlled environmental monitoring over an extended period. These are expensive, patient undertakings, but they are the path from mystery to understanding. As this survey closes, one image remains fixed. Our modern world is saturated with evidence and error in equal measure. The camera gives us new access to fleeting events, but it also inherits the limitations of optics, electronics, and human judgment. Viral attention elevates selected frames into icons of the inexplicable, and our cognitive appetite for faces and agency does the rest. The cases we examine show both the extraordinary power of natural phenomena and the ubiquity of human mediation. They show how ancient physics like the camera obscura can surprise us anew, how chemistry at a remote lake can produce horror and beauty, and how a sensor's rare glitch can create a visual that resists easy sense-making. If there is a singular takeaway, it is this: images that are hard to believe are not inherently untrustworthy. They are invitations. Invitations to ask better questions, gather more data, and test the boundaries of our understanding. They are also invitations to humility. Not every anomaly will resolve quickly, and not every unresolved case is evidence of the miraculous. But each one offers an opportunity to refine our tools, technical, analytical, and communal, and to remind ourselves that the world remains, in important ways, larger and stranger than our current explanations. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into footage and phenomena that push the limits of belief. Tell us in the comments which case you think remains rightly unexplained, and what additional evidence you would want to see to be convinced.